Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure tonight to thank our student organization for the hard work that they've put into this event. I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Idaho State University, and it is my honor to talk about the president of our student organization, Jessica Ray McBean, whose efforts are the reason that we are here tonight and the reason that we have the Indian ambassador speaking with us this evening. Our International Affairs Council is an entirely student-run organization. This event, the Frank Church Symposium, is entirely student-run, and I want to thank our students for their dedication and hard work in that effort. I also want to thank their advisor, Rafael Nujuko, who is also the chair of our International Studies Department, and thank him for his time and effort in helping guide our students in that program as well as in our International Affairs Council. It is also my pleasure to introduce to you our president, President Art Velas, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone, to the Stephen Performing Arts Center. For all of you that may or may not know, this is the nationally ranked performing arts center in universities in the United States, so welcome. It is a great honor and privilege for Idaho State University, our community, and the state of Idaho to introduce His Excellency, Ambassador Arun Singh, India's ambassador to the United States, as our keynote speaker for the 45th Annual Frank Church Symposium. His Excellency served as India's top diplomat to Israel and France and was also the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of India. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1979 after completing his graduate degree in economics from Delhi University. His first assignment was at the Embassy of India in Moscow during the Soviet era. His Excellency has served as Deputy Secretary and Director dealing with East Asia and Pakistan divisions, head of the offices of the Foreign Secretary and the External Affairs Minister of India, and Counselor and Joint Secretary. The topic of His Excellency's is India's U.S. relations, working together for sustainable development. Please give Ambassador Singh a great welcome to Idaho State University. Ambassador.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. And I must begin by acknowledging people who worked very hard to put all of this together. So my thanks are due, of course, to President Arthur and his wife, Dr. Laura Velas, to Dr. Laura Woodworth-Ney, Provost, Dr. Candy Turley Ames, Dean of the College of Arts and Letters, and several of the local leaders here who took their time out to welcome me to this city. Mayor Brian Bladd and his wife Laura Bladd, Pocatello City Council members Roger Bray, Stephen Brown, Craig Cooper, Jim Johnston, Gary Moore and Michael Orr, Jeremy Field, representative for Senator Risch, Dan Billier, former senator of 29th District of Idaho, Judge Peter McDermott, Mark Nye, State Representative, Eva Nye, Casey Felt, Natalia Luke, Heidi Jarvis Grime, and of course Raphael Njoku, who had reached out to me way back in September last year to get my commitment to be with all of you here today. But most of all, I must thank all of you for being here, because it is only through your presence and the interaction that we can share some of the thoughts related to India-US relations and how we work together for sustainable development. I'll divide my talk broadly in three parts. First, looking at the political dimension. And in this area, what are we doing together to create an enabling environment, an enabling framework for sustainability? Because eventually, for any kind of sustainability, political sustainability is critical. The second aspect I'd like to touch upon, the efforts we are making in India in the economic plane to generate sufficient resources for us, to enable us to deal with the challenges we are facing, and through that, how we are cooperating with the United States, also in the economic domain. And finally, after having laid this background, I'd like to touch briefly on the specific aspects that people focus on in today's context when they talk about climate change, renewable energy, and sustainability related to that. As I've been advised, I'll speak for about 30-35 minutes and then would look forward to some questions. And I usually find that the question-answer session tends to be the more interesting part of any discussion. Looking at dimensions related to political sustainability, you may have noticed that now there is growing interest in the United States, in US leadership about India. And you could very well ask yourself, why is there such growing political interest beyond the economic dimension? And if you look around the world today, the two countries with maximum degree of multiculturalism and pluralism are India and the United States. In India today, we have 22 official languages in our constitution. Can you think of any other country that has 22 official languages? We are in that sense like a United States of Europe. If you took at the religious composition of India, 4 or 5 major religions emerged from India: Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, and Hinduism, and several of the world's major religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, have found a welcome home in India. And just looking at India's population composition, we have about 800 plus Hindus, about 180 million Muslims. We are the second largest country in the world in terms of number of Muslims. Some say, well, only 2% of your population is Christian, but 2% in India means 25 million people. And that's more than the Christian population of many countries who define themselves as Christian. And I had served, as was mentioned, as India's ambassador to Israel. And in Israel, we have about 80,000 people of Indian origin, followers of the Jewish faith. And they used to tell me that India was among the few, if not the only country in the world, where there was never anti-Semitism. So in that context, if you look at the world today, the challenges that we are facing, the extremism, the exclusion, clearly the experience we have in India of living and growing up in the midst of diversity is an experience and a message that is an important message in the global context. And therefore, the success of India, of course, it is important for India, but I believe it is important for the United States and it is important for the world. So within that framework also, I find that political leaders and others in the US pay increasing attention to the efforts being made in India. You may recall that last year in January, when President Obama went to India, there were several interesting dimensions related to that visit. He was the first US president to have gone to India on our national day, the Republic Day of India, when we gave to ourselves a constitution after we had become independent, again symbolizing the links between the two countries. And of course, we had adapted our constitution to our own requirement, but also we had looked deeply at the American Constitution and other constitutions when we are looking at the principles that should be embodied there. He was also the first US president to have gone to India twice in his tenure. And in 2009, when the Indian Prime Minister had been invited to the US, he was the first state visitor of the Obama administration. And these are all reflections of the directions in which the leaders of the two countries want to take this relationship. Based on this, we are now expanding our defense cooperation. In the last 5 years, we have bought more than $14 billion worth of defense supplies from the US, more than what we have done with any other country. Today, India does more military exercises with the US than with any other country. Today, the US does more bilateral military exercises with India than with any country outside NATO. And in defense, we are moving away from just a buyer-seller relationship to co-development of technology and co-production. The two governments have identified 6 Pathfinder projects for co-development of technology. 2 of them that we are working on actively now. I believe if we are able to take them to successful conclusion, will once again transform in a major way the nature of our defense and political cooperation. And these deal with aircraft carrier technology and jet engine technology, where we are exploring the dimensions where we could work together to develop new products. Flowing from some of the challenges we face today, we are also working deeply and closely in the area of homeland security, not just in terms of training, capacity building, equipment, but also, for example, in terms of mega city policing. And that is again relevant. Many of you might recall that on 26 November 2008, as people were celebrating Thanksgiving in the United States at that time, the major Indian city of Mumbai had come under a terrorist attack, and for 3 or 4 days, 10 terrorists had held parts of the city hostage, and almost 200 people, including Americans, had been killed at that time. Therefore, and India's is not the only example of something like that. Last year, we saw something happening in Paris, where people recalled, based on what was happening in Paris, the earlier experience of the challenge that had been posed in Mumbai. So mega city policing, cooperation between the police authorities of large cities, dealing with challenges related to fake currency notes, again, are areas that we've been working on. How do we deal with the problem of terrorism, where we share operational intelligence information, work together for capacity building? Another area we had worked closely was dealing with the challenge of piracy off the Horn of Africa. And some years ago, we used to hear very often about ships being hijacked, sailors being taken hostage. And fortunately, with the effort that large number of countries in the world made, including the United States and India, we hear much less of this problem in that part of the world. Maritime security is another domain that we've been working on. You may have noticed that there is only one ocean in the world that goes by the name of one country, and that is the Indian Ocean. And that is because of India's presence in the context of the Indian Ocean, through which we reach out to the Gulf countries, to Africa in our west, and to ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and beyond in our east. Therefore, security in the Indian Ocean, providing net security in this region, providing trade and other connectivity. And this will be a very important part of the world in the coming period if one looks at the issues of sustainability, because there are projections that in about 60 or 70 years from now, 80% of the world's population will be in Africa and Asia. And if that is so, the flows of global trade will take place through the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. And it will be a very important area for facilitating economic well-being and economic activity on a global plane. Afghanistan, again, was an example where India and the United States had worked together. You're all aware of the effort that the US had made in that country after 9/11. We are not a traditional donor, yet we stepped up to provide about $2 billion worth of assistance to Afghanistan. And our assistance had a very deep impact on the ground. We provided transportation facilities through buses. We rebuilt schools. We rebuilt hospitals. We built a 300-kilometer power transmission line through high mountain ranges, which connected Kabul to power supply from Central Asia. And for the first time, Kabul had 24-hour power supply. We built a 300-kilometer road segment that enabled Afghanistan to have an alternative access to the sea. Our effort at stabilizing Afghanistan within the broad framework of the effort that the US and other countries had been making was welcomed by the Afghan people. And in many public opinion polls that are done in Afghanistan, the general response is that India is the most popular country in Afghanistan today. And the Indian Prime Minister had visited Kabul in December, towards the end of December, and he spoke at the Afghan parliament to the parliamentarians. And the parliament building had been constructed and handed over to the people of Afghanistan by India. And in his half-an-hour address, which was interrupted almost 70 times by applause, the parliamentarians were seen crying with emotion. So that was the kind of relationship with which they looked at India. Moving to the economic dimension of the relationship. Today in India, we are making a very determined effort to expand manufacturing, to expand use of digital technology, and to intensify innovation. All these are critical for the effort that we are making for sustainability. We need to expand manufacturing in India because for students who have done economics, unlike a normal developing country which goes from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services, in India we went straight from agriculture to services, skipping manufacturing or expansion of manufacturing in any meaningful way. So today 14% of our GDP comes from agriculture, but almost 60% of our GDP comes from services. Now services can do significant value addition, but sometimes they could face challenges related to job creation. And I'll give you one example. People hear about the IT sector in India, where India has strengths. The IT sector in India generates 7% of our GDP and creates 3 million jobs. Agriculture contributes 14% of our GDP, and 700 million people in India are dependent on agriculture. So you can see immediately the difference in value addition and productivity, and therefore we have no option but to expand manufacturing, to create jobs, to lessen the pressure on agriculture so that productivity in agriculture can also grow. Looking at the expansion on manufacturing, we are now looking at digital technology. Because not only do we have strengths there, but we believe that digital technology has the potential to enable disruptive business models. Several months ago, I made a number of visits to Silicon Valley to understand some of the processes there. And what I noticed was that Indian companies, Indian origin tech entrepreneurs, Indian origin tech workers are an integral part of the innovation happening in the United States on the West Coast in digital technology. And I'll give you some examples, some of which are controversial, but the fact remains that they have changed business models. Uber, for example, with all its controversies, has disrupted the transportation model. Airbnb has disrupted the hospitality model. And therefore, we are trying to see in what way can we use digital technology in India to disrupt business models so that we can address our needs more effectively, not necessarily following the path that Europe or United States may have done, and address our needs economizing on the use of resources. And this again will be a very important area for partnership between India and the United States. Linked partly to digital technology, but standing in its own right, is the entire space of innovation and startups. We know about the efforts being made in the United States in innovation, but there is a lot of cost-effective and niche R&D happening in India. In September 2014, a US space vehicle reached Mars. Within 1 week of that, an Indian space vehicle also reached Mars. And the Indian space vehicle, of course, the US space vehicle had far more capacity. But that having been said, the Indian space vehicle that reached Mars was built at about 1/10 the cost of the US space vehicle, and less than the cost of production of a Hollywood movie dealing with space. In startups, we found new energy in India. The young people in India, and we have a very young population. The median age in India is 29, and the projection is that 50, 60 years from now, the bulk of the Indian population will remain in the working age bracket. And this young Indian population now doesn't want to work for anyone. They want to work for themselves, create new opportunity, create new technology. And in the last 2 years, more than $6 billion have flowed into startups in India. Several unicorns have emerged from India. And we find that entities on the West Coast, Silicon Valley, other areas are heavily involved with the startup effort in India through technology partnership and through financial partnerships. Going ahead, we will have to put a lot of emphasis in India on infrastructure. Because if you look at today's global context, when we hear talk of stagnation, we hear talk of slowing down, and yet we need to expand economic activity in India. One of the ways in which we would be able to kickstart processes would be through enhanced investment in infrastructure. And our plans are to put in about $1 trillion worth of investment in infrastructure over the next 5 years. Roads, ports, power, telecom, railways. In railways, for example, Japan has just announced that it will be giving us a loan of about $15 billion to build a high-speed bullet train line between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. And the loan would be for a period of 50 years at 0.5% and repayable only after 15 years. So it's a significant participation in the effort in India at infrastructure expansion. We need to grow in India at 8 to 10%. This year we grew at 7.6%. Many people have complimented us that this is the highest rate of growth in the world today. So although we may be the fastest growing economy now, compared to our needs, it is not enough. because the picture in India is mixed. And in fact, people say that very often the picture in India is complicated, and whatever you say about India and the opposite of that, both tend to be true. So at one level, we have done reasonably well. We have about 300 million people in India who are described as middle class or upper middle class by European standards. Now, 300 million is a significant number. It is the population of the United States. It is the population of Europe. But it is not enough in our context because we are a country of 1.2 billion people. So people can legitimately ask that what is the situation of the remaining 800, 900 million? Where are they located? And that's where the challenge lies, because a large part of the Indian population does not as yet have sufficient discretionary income. About 200 million people in India still live below the poverty line. More than 300 million people in India, even today, do not have access to commercial energy. And that's a very important figure when we are looking at issues related to sustainability. So we need to grow at 8 to 10% to make sure that people who are so far not participating sufficiently with the processes that are going on also begin to reap the fruits of that process. And it is important because, as we discussed earlier, India is a democracy. People go out and vote, and they feel that they're not benefiting sufficiently process, they change the government. And again, just to mention a few interesting aspects related to democracy in India, the size of our electorate is 830 million. So if you take the electorate of the United States, electorate of Europe, electorate of Brazil, and electorate of Indonesia, add it all together, it is less than the electorate of India. And when we had our elections in May 2014, 70% of the people voted in the elections. So about 550 to 560 million people voted in the elections. Again, in terms of Indian laws, we need to make sure that no person should need to walk more than a mile to get to a polling booth, because not everyone in India has a vehicle. And therefore, we had 1 million polling booths. And in one place in the Gir forest area of Gujarat, there was a polling booth for one person, so it was to enable him to exercise his democratic right. The elections themselves were spread over 3-4 weeks because we concentrated security forces in an area. Votes were cast so that there was no interference with the process. Then we moved them to another area. But when the counting began at the end of that process, within a couple of hours, the trends and the results were all clear, because voting in India has been now for several election cycles 100% electronic. And that is a process and a mechanism which is among the best in the world that is being done, and people have commented on how well that process has been carried out. So going back to the need to grow at 8 to 10%, we believe that in India, we have not contributed to the problem of global warming, because even today, our per capita emissions are only 2 tons per capita. In China, the emissions are about 8 tons per capita. In the US, they are about 14 tons per capita. And one of the reasons why which there is a negative dimension to it, but one of the reasons why we have not contributed significantly to global warming, because as many of you might know, we were colonized by the British in the 18th century. I mean, the same people who also colonized you. When the British came to India in 18th century, India's GDP was 20% of the global GDP. When they left India in 1947, India's GDP was 2% of the global GDP. And the reason was that we completely missed out on the Industrial Revolution. They did not allow industries to develop in India in any significant way because they wanted to use India as a source of raw materials and a market for goods manufactured in Britain. So, of course, we lost out in the Industrial Revolution, but we didn't contribute to emissions and global warming. Although we didn't do that, we still face the consequences of global warming in terms of disrupted rain patterns and disrupted weather patterns, what is happening on our coast. And therefore, going ahead, the high rate of growth that we need to maintain at 8 to 10%, we would like to do to the maximum extent possible on the basis of renewable energy. Today, we are using, for example, about 5 gigawatt of solar energy, but the government has committed that by 2022, we will take that figure to 100 gigawatt of solar energy and 175 gigawatt of renewable energy. Although it looks very ambitious, it can be done because there is a huge expansion happening in India in solar energy power generation. 3 years ago, the cost of solar power per unit as available to the consumer was 20 cents per unit of power. Today, it has come down to 7 cents per unit of power because of the technological changes taking place. In the US, it's about 5 cents per unit of power. Through further technological changes, if we can bring this down to 5 or 4 cents per unit of power, no further subsidy would be required to be given for use of solar energy in India. And that will suddenly change the utilization and growth of solar energy in the Indian context. And it was because of that that during the Paris Climate Change Summit in December last year, India brought an initiative to the table of an international solar alliance of countries globally that are rich in solar power or rich in solar power technology coming together to see how they can pool together their effort to push further development in this sector. And this initiative was adopted by the summit. Large number of countries have signed on to it. A secretariat of the International Solar Alliance has been set up in India, and the US also is a part of that. Another area that we are promoting in this framework is smart cities, which are being looked at with interest in different parts of the world. But based on some of the US experience, we have identified 100 cities in India as a start, which would be developed as smart cities in terms of efficient transportation, efficient use of power, looking at better delivery of healthcare, education. After selecting the first 100, through further selection, 5 have been identified for first funding by the federal government and the state government. And US has come forward as a partner for 3 cities in India, Visakhapatnam, Ajmer and Allahabad, where US entities will work as catalysts, as partners to take forward this process. And from the US government side, the US TDA, Trade and Development Agency, is part of that, and several private sector enterprises have also been involved. So let me just stop there to say that when we look at sustainability, we see it both in the political context, in the context of the economic framework that we are providing, and more specifically, in terms of renewable energy, what more can be done. And here one of the initiatives we are taking is partnership with the US in a program called PACE, Partnership for Clean Energy. And within that we have PACE-R, Partnership for Clean Energy Research, and PACE-D, Partnership for Clean Energy Development, where both governments have put in money to bring together entities from US and India to work together in the area of efficient buildings, advanced biofuels, as well as solar energy. And so through this effort, we believe we can meet some of the challenges that the world is facing today. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
We will take a few questions.
I was never accused of not being able to talk loudly enough. In regard to the solar energy, are you starting manufacturing of solar panels on a wide scale now, in addition to using them so that you have your own manufacturing companies?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a very important question. So that's certainly our objective, and we would, as part of this huge expansion, also want to do manufacture of solar panels in India, and that would again be part of the Make in India, Expand Manufacturing in India program that we have. So we are working on that. This is an area where we've had some disagreement with the US, because we took some steps to kickstart manufacturing in India, and the US has taken us to WTO dispute settlement, and so we'll see how that process plays out. But clearly it is in our scheme to try and expand manufacturing in India. I think we'll get to you. There's somewhere on the way.
Thank you so much for coming. And just a quick question for you. I have a little bit of a unique perspective. My wife is from India.
Little louder, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's very rare for people to say I'm not loud enough. My wife is from India, and I spent a month in New Delhi this past summer. And one of the things that struck me was the pollution in the city. When I was up in the Himalayas, it was pristine, it was beautiful. But in the city, there was a lot of pollution. And I see the Delhi government has recently instituted the alternating day car program. What steps is the central government taking to address pollution? Because, well, sustainability is great, but it would be, I'm also curious to see what you're doing about the pollution.
No, thank you. I think, as I said, although we have not contributed to the problem of global warming, we are facing its consequences. And in several cities in India, including Delhi, there have been challenges related to enhanced pollution levels. There's certainly growing consciousness because there are health impacts and other impact. And as you mentioned, the Delhi government also to sensitize people took a major initiative where for 2 weeks we had the odd-even scheme for vehicles on the roads. And so let's see. So the people are working on those and trying to see how with different use of fuels, more use of public sector transportation, smart cities, efficient use of resources, how we can address this problem. So thank you. I think there's a lady here who had raised her hand. Maybe you speak just without the microphone.
So with the building collapses that have been happening with a lot of labor work in India, what would you suggest is the best solution for the harsh labor conditions that some undergo in a lot of the factories in India, because there have been a big burst of building collapses?
So, are you talking about collapse of buildings that are being made or buildings where people have been working in? So there have been instances, but it's not been too significant compared to the challenges you see elsewhere. But the problem of any building collapse essentially means better regulation during construction and subsequently. And I think ultimately the strength in India lies in its open society. So at one level in India, we have a vibrant and free media. We have 300 24/7 news channels. The civil society in India is extremely active. So there are problems and challenges in India, but all the problems and challenges in India are being brought up front by the media and civil society in India and others. And that is the best way to highlight any challenges and problems and force not just policymakers, but everyone else involved in the process to address those challenges. And I think therein lies the strength and potential for the future in India.
First, if I might, I want to compliment you on your almost
I can't see you where. Okay. Please, sorry.
your encyclopedic knowledge of a country with so many people. The question I had, you mentioned global warming. In agriculture, we pay close attention to world weather patterns. Is India also planning in the future to be affected by sea level rise?
Yes, so that again is a phenomenon that is bound to impact on India for two main reasons. One, we have a huge coastline, almost 7,500 kilometers of a coastline, both on the west and east of India. And therefore, sea rise would certainly impact on the Indian coastal areas beyond any kind of additional weather impact they would have. But we also have large number of islands. I think people don't very often factor in that both on our west coast and east coast we have significant island chains. For example, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands of India are very close to Myanmar, Thailand and Indonesia. And because of that, Indonesia is our neighbor only 80 kilometers away from India. So we have a large group of islands and they will certainly also be impacted. So that's certainly a problem also that we deal with. Please.
After independence, the Nehru government and the Congress Party initiated a lot of protectionist policies in the economy in India. And I'm wondering how we're doing with abandoning some of that protectionism that lingers from independence time.
So again, I think we have to look at issues in a historical context. And I just described for you the fact that before British came to India, we were 20% of the global GDP. And when they left India, we were 2% of global GDP. And there was hardly any manufacturing in India. There was no capital goods sector. So in that historical context, the Indian leadership felt that certain steps needed to be taken to enable industry in India to take off. And some steps were taken in that context. But since 1990, our economy has been globalizing and we are becoming more and more part of the global processes, trade processes, and various steps taken since then has enabled deeper integration with that. So today, for example, almost 50% of our GDP is generated by the external sector. So what you are describing is clearly something very much of the past.
You previously spoke on your relationship.
A little louder, please.
Sorry. You previously spoke on your relationship between India and the Horn of Africa. I was wondering what you have found as the most effective ways of dealing with those issues and those conflicts and insurrections of piracy that come from that. Would you say it's more of economic development and reduction in poverty, or would you link it more with diplomacy of those governing bodies of those countries, such as Somalia?
So let me just, I think it's a very difficult question to answer. Certainly economic issues would play a role because if people don't have jobs, then certain activities get generated. The political issues would also have played a role because there was instability in that region. But there were, from all the information that was coming out, people who were operating on the ground had wider links. So I think organized crime and terrorism also had a role to play in what was happening. So the picture was certainly complex, and the effort of all the players who were responding to that challenge while dealing with some of those issues which have not yet been fully addressed was also to make it not cost effective for those who were resorting to piracy in that region. And I think that certainly worked, because it was not cost effective for them anymore. And so we have to see what works in a particular context.
I have two questions. It's like one question is like, I know that India is high country for the standard like hours day. Like
Sorry,
they
like?
do nine hours in a day. And then the other question is how many jobs you created in future by the Indian, because the Indian, they have 800 million people, they didn't have jobs. So what do you think in future by your country they help those 800 millions to create jobs until 2020 or until 2030?
So if I understood you correctly, what you're saying is what is going to be the specific measures for job creation? Is that what you're asking in the economic process? Yes. So I think job creation has to be ultimately important, because that is one way of empowering people. That is one way of ensuring better distribution of income and wealth. That is also a very important way for stability in society, and also for preventing radicalization. So all those are factored in, and population of India is significant. And again, let me give you a figure which will both surprise and amuse people, that in terms of our population, we create one Australia every year. So our population goes up by about 20 million people. Therefore, the need for job creation in the context of what you are doing is very significant, and that aspect is given particular attention. Again, we have to understand that in today's global context, what jobs to prepare people for is also a challenge, because with the globalization that has happened, jobs are shifting from one country to another. Today, country A may be competitive, but tomorrow country B may be competitive in that area. So we need to skill and train people, not just to be able to do a particular job, but to be flexible in terms of learning and adapting to further job requirements. And these are all issues that are certainly being addressed in India. Maybe we take one last question. All right. I think the lady here.
Oh,
Somebody at the back. All right, we'll take two. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm a recent graduate in international political economy. So you talked about the disparity between the amount of GDP produced from agriculture and services, in that agriculture produced less GDP and services produced more, but agriculture provided more jobs, whereas services produced less jobs. Was that correct?
So not 100% correct, but services contribute to, all right, if I took the overall figure, you're right. Agriculture contributes 14% of our GDP, and we have 700 million people dependent on agriculture. Services contribute 60% of our GDP, and the number of people working in services is far less. So you're right, yes.
Okay, so you talked about how because of the British, India missed out on the Industrial Revolution and thus global warming because they didn't develop their manufacturing. And you talked about how India wanted to develop more of their manufacturing jobs. Why do you think that, or why does India think that manufacturing will fill that gap?
Why does India think that manufacturing will?
Yes.
Fill that gap?
Fill the gap between, you talked about how...
So no, I think I've understood your question. What you're saying, why do I feel that manufacturing will fill that gap? So you're right.
Yes.
So manufacturing will fill that gap, because if it is not very high-tech manufacturing, and if it's not 3D printing, clearly with expansion of manufacturing, you create jobs. More we create jobs in manufacturing, we will be able to reduce the dependence on agriculture. Because part of our challenges in agriculture is that with a huge dependence on agriculture, the average size of land holding in agriculture has become very small, less than 2 hectares. As a result, our capacity to bring new methods, mechanization, new technology also gets challenged. So again, at one level, the volume, the aggregate volume and value of production in India of many crops, cereals, even dairy is among the top in the world, but the productivity is very low. So we need to reduce the dependence on agriculture, also to enable the productivity increases to take place. And again, for that, we have to move people to manufacturing and give them opportunities there. So I'll take last question. I think the lady here had raised her hand, please. So, you know, I must say this is a question, for some reason I keep getting asked. And my answer has two parts. First part, that as a foreign diplomat accredited to a country, we never comment on the political processes in our host country. Having said that, it is very easy for me to explain to people in India whatever is happening here, because in India we are a very noisy and vibrant democracy. And so if you looked at the processes in India, nobody in India is surprised.
Thank you very much for coming this evening, and please join us upstairs for a small reception. We'd like to have all of you join us, and there will be a few minutes with the ambassador at the reception as well. Thank you very much.
I just let's give the students and the faculty